My name is Jeff Saltzman. I'm the CEO of Org Vitality. Welcome to our webinar series, our Fireside Chat series. We're going to be having one of these a week for the next 6 weeks, actually. And the first one today is very, very exciting. I'm the host of the first Fireside Chat series. My background is IO psychology. I'm also adjunct at Binghamton, and I've been doing this for a while. Very excited, though, to introduce our interviewee, I guess you could call him, today for the Fireside Chat. It's Allan Church. Allan has over 30 years of experience in the field. He's considered very much a thought leader in the space of talent management and organizational development, as well as industrial organizational psychology. His last position, he spent 21 years at PepsiCo, and his last position was Senior Vice President of Global Talent Management. In addition to running his own consulting business now called Maestro, he's also an adjunct full professor at Teachers College, where he teaches strategic talent management. So welcome, Allan, and thanks for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jeff. I'm excited to be here and chat on your Fireside Chat, right? Your first Fireside Chat.
Our first Fireside Chat. I think we've got a whole, we're going to want to keep these things as informal as possible. And we've got, as I said, a series of speakers from a variety of different backgrounds coming in the next 6 weeks, talking about various topics. And we're trying to keep this as informal as possible. And to that end, you'll see at the bottom of your screen that there's a Q&A button. And if you have any questions that you want to ask Allan, specifically, anything we don't cover, please submit the question by pressing that button. And one of our folks is going to be monitoring that. And hopefully we'll have time at the end to get to as many of those questions as we can. As we go, also, just a couple of administrative things. This session is being recorded. So if you don't want to be in a recorded session, now's a good time to leave. But also, the recorded session will be made available for people who signed up and for whatever reason couldn't attend. There's no slides for today. It's just a conversation. So our usual is to send out slides afterwards, but there really isn't any. So we won't be doing that with these Fireside Chats. And with that, Allan, why don't we jump in and start asking some questions? And again, we're going to try and keep this as free form as we possibly can with as much give and take as we possibly can. So let me jump down here. I'm going to first stop sharing for a moment. And there we go. Okay. So, Allan, your career, especially your career at PepsiCo, you really covered a huge amount of ground. And we may have to take this in like bite-sized chunks rather than just sort of ask you to say, so what did you do? so let's take it a little bit at a time, maybe. But first off, if you think of the long arc of changes that you oversaw at PepsiCo over decades, right? In the area of strategic surveying and the area of talent management, can you spend a few minutes discussing how those evolved over the 2 decades in which you were there?
Sure. It's been a long journey, and I think, and to all my friends, nobody's going to be surprised that I have this, but I can't have a thing here to slam it down. But yeah, I think, I mean, it's evolved pretty significantly, Jeff. First the survey side, and then I can talk talent management. But on the survey side, you know, I think you and I were chatting about this. I was brought in, I was doing strategic surveys for Warner Burke for 10 years before, and as a consultant. And so when PepsiCo called me to come in, it was really to join this center team, the enterprise team, which was small then. And when I left, it was like 18 people. So it was small with myself and Jeff Shipman back then. And it was to come in and, quite honestly, fix the survey and fix 360. So that was my primary goal when I got there. And the challenge.
And Allan, at that time, do you remember how big PepsiCo was at the time? Was it like
I wanna say-
200,000?
I want to say like 120, Jeff, at that time.
120,000. Okay.
Yeah,
So I
'cause
mean, you're coming in to fix a big system.
Yeah, it was a big survey system. We had just sold the bottlers off like a year or two before, so that was 50,000 that had left the system. And we literally had bought Quaker the day I joined, so that was 10,000 new. So they're always changing at PepsiCo. I think now it's like 280, but because we bought the bottlers back, but it was big. And the challenge was that several years before, he had just gone through a previous CEO change to Roger Enrico, and he was not a huge fan of HR. So all the old school stuff of HR that was really strong before that, Roger kind of gutted the function, to be honest. And there wasn't much left in the center. And so there were HR practices in the field, but not the center. And the survey had been saved by Paul Russell. I don't know if you know Paul Russell, Jeff, but
not personally, no.
An IO guy. He went to Google, he retired from Pep, went to Google, but Paul had saved it, and it was 24 questions. And I know by today's standards, that might be okay. Back then, I was coming from 120, 150 item survey. So, and for different purposes, but it was a small survey. And my first goal was to what insights can I glean from it? So I looked at this data on 24 questions, and I built a deck for the CEO, for Steve Reineman, and there was nothing in it. I mean, there was just no trends. There was nothing going on because all 24 questions were designed to be frontline focused, very much local action planning. What's how satisfied are you with your plant conditions and safety in your workplace, which is great. But you roll that up to 120,000 people and nobody cares, right? Because it's just not telling Steve anything. So that was what I was dealing with. And so I tried to do my first analysis, and it didn't say anything. And so I was told, all right, go fix it, right? I mean, I was complaining about it. I would still go fix it. So the first thing I did then, and some of what I did still remains to today's practice, but the first thing I did was add a model to the survey, right? So I went with the Burke-Litwin. It was too complicated, so I ended up doing a condensed version. But that framework is still pretty much there in its form. And I also went with this idea of sort of, kind of 3 tiers to the items that you would include, right? And the first tier was the same kind of stuff. It was frontline focus, and people could use it, very actionable. The second tier were things that were tied to strategic clients. So rather than have people do their own surveys, I went to D&I and talked to them. I went to communications, I went to legal, I went to compliance, and got a couple of questions from each group that was meaningful to them, which would enable strategy for their part. And then I went to Steve and said, all right, and this is one of my tricks, if you will. I have like 5 tips and tricks for survey work, but this is number 1. And I asked Steve, what if you had anything you wanted to ask, what would it be? You only have 4 questions, so I'm not going to give you the whole landscape, but what would you ask? And it was modeled on the GE, top 5, magic 5 or something it was. And, he thought about it and he said, okay, here are my 5 questions. And the thing that I didn't realize at the time, Jeff, was he didn't know what a question was. So right. he gave me kind of complex questions, but also I'll write it. And right. And that was great. And I said, wow, and I happened to be traveling at the time. I was actually in South Africa at the time, seeing the business there. And I remember being 16 hours behind, whatever it was. And, or 16 hours, whatever the time difference, it was massive. And so it was the middle of the night for him when I was writing him back. And I said, this is going to cost you $1 of writing, right? So, I mean, do you realize you just added, $500,000 to your survey? Can I give you these in kind of closed item format instead? And so I did that for him, and he was super excited. And that was when we got that data back, and I ran it by different cuts and ran it by different groups. That was the beginning of the survey getting teeth back at PepsiCo.
Yeah. So it sounds like what you did is, here's a core. It's going to be an enduring core. Let's now go out to some stakeholders and make sure that their itches are scratched.
Right.
And then you said, how do we get senior management buy-in?
That's right.
And that's the story. And it also sounds like part of the frustration was you didn't have enough data to actually tell a story.
That's right. And that's my challenge. I know it's a different question later, but we're going to jump around where it makes sense, right? But one of the issues I've had with survey, practice, thought, leadership thinking in the field over the years is I think surveys can be too short, to be honest. And I think people err on the side sometimes of quote unquote simplicity at the expense of insights. And considering that, take the pulse survey methodology out for a minute, considering that surveys you do once a year, sometimes once every 2 years, which I don't like either as a practice, but PepsiCo did that for a while. I find it too difficult to create very meaningful insights without items of different kinds, you know? And so that is something I fought with all the way to, so I ran the survey up until, I want to say 2012, the first time. And towards the end of that, I remember being called by Indra, our next CEO, right, to stand up in front of the town hall and explain how the survey was anonymous, for example, and promised that I was going to make it shorter at the same time. So she promised the entire global organization, called on me by surprise, saying, hey, I'm going to make this, Allan's going to make this shorter, don't worry, which of course I did not respond to. But I also had the challenge of trying to explain, anonymity when it really wasn't, right? It's confidential,
Right.
but
Right.
That's the thing with surveys. And I think Indra honestly understood it when I was running it. I think it changed hands a couple of times over the midterm there. And I think we got a little bit of this idea of going slick, and that made them smaller. And a little bit, I think we lost a little bit of energy on the surveys. And we confused it with Pulse, and we can talk Pulse too. But then towards the last couple of years, when and I think you have Chris Rotolo coming on in a couple of weeks, right? Who's a really
Right.
good friend. He worked with me at PepsiCo for over a decade. Chris got the survey back, and then I, got the survey with him and after him. And we had gone back to, Chris really drove this too, and we continued to go back to the strategic content and, both actionability, but also giving CEOs what they want to hear, and the CHROs and the senior leaders. And that really kind of evolved for me from the practice. It kind of went from crap, honestly, to quality and deep and depth, and also, insights to too light a little bit, and people just took it for granted. Yeah. Back to insights. And the example of the last set of insights that were really helpful, Jeff, we included things like HR, content on HR practices. So, for example, one of the things we were driving was, did you have a development conversation with your manager, which I think most companies think is a good thing, right? But we didn't really have a way of doing accountability. So we actually baked that in to the surveys, and then had nudge technology, and you guys are experts in all that too, to drive that up. And so there are ways of interfacing, practices along with survey data to really make it a meaningful part of the entire HR strategy, not just a standalone survey. And that's what I saw towards the very end. And we were doing return to office surveys. I think we did 5 of them in succession, and we got ahead of it early, and we're predicting sites and where people are coming back, and all kinds of great stuff that literally to the very end was of my tenure there until I retired was super front of plate.
Yeah. As you're talking, it reminds me, now I've been doing surveys also for a
right.
decent amount of time.
Several years, right, Jeff?
Several years, coming up on about 35.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Maybe 40, I'd lose count.
Yeah.
But the longest survey I think I've ever done was 225 items. And that was probably back in the late 1980s kind of thing.
Yeah.
But an average survey back then was 125 items kind of thing. Yeah. And today the average survey is probably, 40, 50 items at most, something like that. But I remember one CEO coming up to me and saying, after I presented all of this information to him, and I thought I had done a nice job telling the story, he goes, if you were good, you could do all this with one question.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I know.
I was like, how do you even respond to that,
Yeah. Well, and it's, again, it goes back to the CEO probably only cares about a few, right? So even towards the end there, our latest CEO, if you will, the fourth of my time there, Ramon was interested in only a handful of things on the survey. The rest, he said, take care of it. But those few that he was interested in, he was super interested in, right? So as long as kind of, that trick, as long as you get the CEO questions in there, that really drives pull, even if you don't share the rest of it with them necessarily in depth, right?
One thing I found, and I'd love your opinion on this also, is when we present back to CEOs, we want to tell a story, but we want to tell a story that they're interested in, as you're referring to. So for instance, we tend not to say, okay, what about communications? What about training? What about decision making? But rather, let's look at your first strategic priority. And let's say, here's your strategic priority. what do we know from the survey results that informs us as to what's enabling you to achieve that priority and what's getting in the way? Have you ever taken that approach to your storytelling, or do you think it works or doesn't work, or what would you say?
Yeah, I would say that works well if the content of the survey fits. I mean, I think that's
Mhm.
the challenge, right? So if you did have the ability to get to the senior team or the CEO and say, what are your priorities that we're trying to address, and you've got questions in there, I think it's perfect. But even so, even without that, I think the way that I approach storytelling at PepsiCo, and even before, but more at PepsiCo, was not the model itself, because the model itself is great for whatever you have. I mean, models are models, right? Whatever you have is great for the appendix, like all the items listed by the different categories, whatever they are. But the first 10 or 12 pages, it's a storyline, and you've got to be really good at, you've got to find things that either resonate or are going to, basically cause dissonance, and then give them an insight as to why, right? So one of the things that I was doing with the team is working on storytelling. And part of that is, to your point about the strategic element, we would start with, okay, what's the data say? Now find me some interesting insights. So the last two we did with my team, I said, go off and bring me back some things. So they brought me back stuff, and I said, well, this is what it looks like, but there's not story here. So try these cuts. And so it would be cuts based, but even the cuts would be relative to what cuts are important, not 10,000 cuts. You can do that, but so what if age is not, doesn't, or tells you something different, but so what? Is it age because it's age and tenure? Is it tenure? Is it different functions? Is it sectors? Is it performance ratings underneath, if you can get to that? And so what we would often do is say, D&I was a big agenda for us always, right? For many companies. So we would always have a D&I storyline. And maybe that was the whole thing, maybe not, depending on the year. But there might be a storyline on development conversations, right? Because that's also part of the HR strategy. Or maybe it was on sustainability. At one point for Indra, it was all about sustainability. And so we had questions in there that addressed that, but we also told the story relative to where parts of the world are driving it well in our company and where they're not, and how do the people feel in those parts. Right? So to your point, it's always, even if you don't go specifically with a strategy up statement up front, by making it linked to things that the PEC or the executive committee is talking about, you can really make it have teeth. And again, the rest of it is great. Engagements in the back, sure, or whatever, but work-life balance in the back, unless one year it's a big topic, right?
And that approach that you're describing, what I find that it does, which is fairly important, if you're a practitioner in the field, people would say, we spent months and months and months working on the survey, collecting the data, analyzing the data, and then we get 5 minutes on the CEO's calendar.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I'm like, well, maybe if you talk about the things that are important to the CEO in terms of what's enabling or preventing them from achieving their goals, you would get more time. And in general, that's what I have seen over the years. If you do it the way you described it, you will get more time.
Yeah. The other thing I would say, Jeff, too, so another sort of, I don't know if this is one of my tricks or just, I actually have 17 points to one of your questions, by the way. I don't know if we'll get to all of those 17, but one of the things that I think has really, been useful over the years, and particularly the last 5 or 6, is, and it's very much so when you get a new CEO or a new CHRO, is timing the data coming back, right? So yes, to your question earlier, in the old days when I got there, we were doing surveys on paper, right? I mean, we were doing 2000 was online, it was cool and new, and people were afraid of it, and the rest were paper. We had 40 translations, we had paper being delivered to plants and mailboxes, all kinds of things. By the end, we were all online for as much as we could be, right? But which speeds it up. But the other thing is, on the back end, people don't want to wait anymore. They can't wait anymore, right? So you've got a week or 2 weeks. And so one of the things that we focused on is turning that initial set of insights around to the senior team, even if the rest isn't done yet. And you know this from working with us, because we pull the data early, even before the reports are ready, right?
Right.
And so one of the tricks for me is to say, get to the CEO and the C-suite early with the data so they feel comfortable before it rolls out. So I would never want it rolling out from the bottom up first. And I know some companies approach it as, hey, open access, everybody go own your stuff. And I think that's important. But I would always try to get the senior person first aligned to the messages and set that up first, because then they know about it. They're not surprised, and they can start to think about it when people come to them, right? So that's a piece there. But I think the other one is time it if you can, so that the results can be shared in big strategic meetings. And this was something that we did really well the last 2 or 3 years with COVID. We had the survey data, whether it was Pulse or the big one, come back the week before the top 200 call, right? And we were having those quarterly, so it really enabled us to have opportunities to do that. Or the CHRO meeting, or the executive committee meeting, right? If you have them all come back right before then, you go in, they're hungry for the insights, and they ask lots of questions, and they haven't seen their stuff yet. And that causes immense pull. That was a great thing we did at the end of last December. I shared with the entire executive committee, and this is probably the best survey presentation I've done in my career. I got in there, and they were all hungry for the data. They hadn't seen their stuff yet. And I shared with them new insights, and they just ate it up, and immediately they were texting for the real data, which of course, different problem on the system, but nonetheless, impact for the survey, and it really set the tone for let's use it this year.
Right. So it created a nice pull rather than a push on that.
Yeah.
Let's flip over for a minute. And I think, we'll spend time talking about surveys and other aspects about surveys. But on the talent management side, let me ask you the same question. Sort of in the 20 some years that you were working in the talent management space, how has it evolved in your mind, and where do you think it's going?
Yeah, so the talent management space is an interesting one, because I would argue talent management as a label didn't exist when I got there. Like, I don't even think the first SIOP doesn't even have it as a category still to this day. It's not a category you can submit against. But I think we did one of the first, if not the first ever session on TM in 2.6 with Silzer and a couple other folks, I think were in on it. And that turned into the book with Ben Dowell, right? That 2010 SIOP book. But back then the practices were there, right? So succession was there, and selection and assessment to some extent, hypos for sure. But it was a little bit of the same problem, Jeff, in that a lot of that had been gutted, at least at PepsiCo when I first got there, and they were building it back up. It wasn't my space yet, but they were building it back up. But it wasn't called TM. It was just, talent discussions kind of stuff. And once the hypo craze started to take off, and that's a little bit of the reaction, I think, to having talent leave massively for the dot-coms in the late 90s, early 2000s, and also diversity becoming a real push and people leaving for inclusive environments. That just drove the need to focus on talent more specifically and move away from the big culture change efforts. I mean, they still exist. You're always going to have OD, always going to have that. And that's what I call the, focus on the many. But focus on the few became very big starting in 2.6 to 8. And then it took off. And then everything was about TM. It's like creating a TM function and, creating TM practices, and it all went into hypos and assessments. And I think it reached its height in maybe 16 or 17. And, everybody there's TM books, everything's out there. And I think what's happened, interestingly, is I wrote a piece in 218 about predictions of the future. And I thought the few would continue to be very big. And it's still there. But COVID and the whole response to remote and the changing nature of work and relationships remotely and all that stuff has really put the OD world back into play, much more so than I thought it would be. And so now, I see a lot of people talking about abandoning assessment, abandoning hypo stuff. And that's interesting, but I don't think that's necessarily the right answer. And I just did a benchmark survey that I presented, Saturday at LEC on hypo practices, and 85% of companies still do assessment and still have hypo programs. So it's there. I just think we're not talking about it as much, Jeff. But it's still there and important.
So if you think of, when you talked about surveys and talent management, and you came in, you say it was gutted, and then you brought it back up. So is this a natural kind of pattern? The pendulum swings one way and then the other way? Or do you think it's based on who happens to be the CEO of any particular organization?
Yeah, that's a great question that maybe even, when if we have time, we could hear from some of the audience on that. Because I personally, I think there's probably some of both elements to it. And I'm sure I'd love to hear what you think about it too. But it seems to me that new practices that come out are really hot for a while and everybody wants some, right? So I remember in the 90s, you probably remember surveys were cool and new in a way, like better than just SAT surveys. And 360 was so hot, people were afraid of it. Now, both of those, the practice is pretty established. The tech is super established. And again, you guys have some really good stuff that we use, but that's established, right? So what's important is the content now and how it gets used. And I think for both those tools, and I think for hypos and assessment and TM, it's the same thing. I think we had this whole hot period of, we need a hypo definition. We need some tools. Okay, we now know pretty much what's there, what works, what doesn't. Now it's into how do you use it? Do you use it well? And let's get the 9-box right or whatever it is. So I think the cycles are there, but I would also say, having lived in this field, and I'm sure your clients over the years in different places, you've seen this, who's there matters. Who's in the organization at the time matters, and what kind of function they built and what kind of credibility they have, right? So I lived through four CEOs, 5 CHROs, and 17 bosses. 6 who have gone on to be CHROs of other companies. And I was the glue. My team turned over multiple times. And hello again to some of my friends on the chat who worked with me. But for us, it was a lot of having a very consistent argument as to why we do what we do. And I think if you change out people in TM or in leading those functions, those specialist functions, you lose that. And I think you do flop around a lot. So it's a concern I have, honestly, of any company that has a big agenda, that when the leaders change, it may be at risk. So I think it's both to answer your questions in a long-winded way.
Well, and it's hard to motivate, I find anyway, it's hard to motivate managers internally if they get into a mindset, whether it's a survey or talent management, of this too shall pass.
Yeah.
So all they got to do is keep their head down long enough, and they won't have to bother actually doing anything about it.
Yeah.
So then you got to say, how do you motivate them to really do what it is you need them to do to be successful?
Yeah.
So if you think about the changes that we've talked about in survey and talent management, when people ask me what I do, I always view myself as, I'm trying to help a company be a better place so that the people inside have better experiences working at that company. So I view it sort of as there's a company level and the individual level kind of thing. If you think about that for a minute and you think about the changes, is there anything that jumps out as, this has been a real positive? This is something that's really made people's lives better within these organizations, if the survey or talent management move from A to B kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because again, I'm always of this OG TM mindset, right? So the many and the few. I think the emphasis on the OG side is always about positive growth for the organization, right? So you're going in. My job on the OD survey side is to say, let's help the organization understand the pain points. Let's give them some actionable results, and let's make it better for people. Right? That is the pure OD at heart, which is frustrating when they don't listen to your data. Right? That's that side.
Right.
The TM side, though, is a little bit different. The TM side is, let's help the organization be more successful and sustain itself, right? If not grow, and that growth then drives more opportunities for other people in the company. But it's more leader focused. It's very much, how are we going to help identify the top 10 people out of the 30 or the top 25 out of the 200 that are going to run the company, and let's really focus on developing them. So it's a small group, but that small group has a massive impact over time. So they're both sort of missions, and I do consider myself value-driven, mission-oriented that way, but they're very different entry points. And I've had a lot of debates over the years with people about hypo talent management work, because it's exclusive, right? By definition, a hypo model and assessment is exclusive, not inclusive. But to your point about impact, on the big side, I would say inclusion, the culture of inclusion for PepsiCo. When I got there, I mean, I was literally told, there was a bullet fired at my head that will get you at some point in your career. I was told the place is like skating down the hallway with roller skates and your hair on fire. And the third one I was told was, there's no water in the Pepsi pool. So, I mean, like, that's what I walked into. And that's sort of the culture at the time. And then we had our first ever head of D&I created, global head of D&I. And I worked with him, Ron Harrison. I traveled around and we created the first ever inclusion survey, 60 items, just inclusion, outside of our big survey, and ran that for North America. And those insights got massively used. And even to this day, there's a few items that have carried through. But that whole effort led to the first ever global inclusion training, mandated by the center and paid for by the CEO. The first ever pulse surveys there, all kinds of infrastructure over time and awards and everything. It was a massive inclusion cultural agenda. And I don't know, I mean, some of my friends on here can comment about their experiences there, but it compared to 2001, the organization is dramatically improved in terms of its appreciation for differences and its inclusive behavior to the extent that they can be, right? I mean, nobody's going to be perfect, but it's much, much better. Even to the point of, you'll love this, Jeff. When I first got there, we had half-day Fridays, but nobody took them because if you were seen leaving the building before like 5 o'clock on a Friday, you were seen as a slacker. Mm-hmm. As I left, I was just told, like, we're one of the companies who have not yet driven everybody back in a mandate. And we had people never coming in Fridays. I mean, it's just a different place.
Things change. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can't attribute it all to the survey work, but certainly, right. But I will say that, Indra, the CEOs were behind it, all four of them actually in the end. And it really has driven the culture with data to get people there. I mean, we put manager accountability in, we put people results, all kinds of things. So it's not just a one and done, but I've seen massive change there. So that's on the culture side. On the leader side, I have to feel good that almost every single member of the executive committee sitting today I've assessed earlier in their career, including the CEO 5 years before he was selected. So that's on the leader side, right? And the company is still very successful, which is good. But I feel like I helped the senior side as well as the
you helped create that success, right?
Yeah, or at least sustain it. Yeah.
So with all this stuff going on, are there any changes that took place that you say, well, wish that hadn't happened, or that change is, we could have, maybe you were responding to pressure or something of that sort, but maybe it wasn't the best thing. Does anything spring to mind in that space?
Yeah, on the survey side in particular, or
either side.
Yeah, I think on the survey side, it was not necessarily because I moved off it, although that happened, but at that time. But I do think it was this new leader. One of the new leaders came in who wanted the survey to be glitzier and wanted it to be more contemporary with models out there. And there was nobody able. There were IOs working for this person, but there was nobody able to fight the good fight to say, listen, I can accommodate that while I do something else. And so the survey did get kind of reduced again in impact to go for kind of the interesting topics,
So looking for that shiny new thing in the water kind of thing.
The energy topic, right? And I don't want to get anybody upset about their favorite topic, but I've just never found energy to be a survey thing. I don't know. It just doesn't. I don't know what you do with that. And then the friend at work. I mean, again, not to go after anybody's content, but if you don't have a friend at work, what's the company going to do about that? It's not an actionable thing for a company, right? It's interesting, and I get it's predictive, but it's not an actionable strategic item. So I was a little bit disappointed when that happened, and I was glad we could build it back up. And Chris led the way on that with his team at the time. But the other one on performance management, I would say we knew when I first got there that people were being paid for just delivering results at all costs, right? We used to call it bodies in the wake. And we, with Steve and then later Indra, we went to 50-50 business and people results, weighting them equally, which I thought was fantastic. And the organization received it well. It was never perfect, of course, but towards the end of that, in the middle, like I want to say 17, 18, somehow that got abandoned. And the two ratings became short and long-term goals instead, with an idea towards driving innovation, but you lost the people component. That was a step backwards, in my opinion, and I was never a fan of that.
So let me just ask specifically about, some of the things we're hearing today, that there's pressure on practitioners to supply, or things like continuous listening and frequent pulsing. Do you have any thoughts on that? You can continuous listen through surveys, but also continuous listen to your talent management folks.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I do. I mean, the continuous listening thing, I think, is a great concept from the point of view of an OD perspective, right? It's great to have a voice, great to have an option. My concern is and I saw this at PepsiCo, we did stop it from happening, unfortunately, but when people think that's the replacement for surveys, right? Or replacement for manager feedback tools. I mean, because what happens is, regardless of how much you try, It's never going to be 100% anonymous or people won't take it seriously, right? So if they do, then the leadership doesn't take it seriously. They think people aren't committed. And if it's not anonymous, the people responding don't take it seriously because they think they're being monitored. So I've never seen that answer work that way. I think it's great for innovation. It's great for some ideas for changing things or big questions people want to ask, getting a feel, getting a pulse. It's not great for strategic change or culture change of any kind per se in my mind. So that whole methodology, if you're going to replace your survey, I'm super worried because a lot of people won't do it. And then you're only getting some people, the loudest ones, and there's psychology on who the loudest ones are sometimes, right? But
right. So
I don't like that from that point of view. But if you have it to augment, that's great. If you have some sort of process like that. I think on the Pulse side, again, Pulse surveys are great if you use them the right way. And again, use them as part of your strategy, but not a replacement for the big surveys. I've seen people argue, oh, we'll just do some pulses and add it all up. And the answer is no. No. So because you can't action plan, right?
Yeah. Well, right. You've got all sorts of statistical sampling issues and things like that.
And people won't buy it.
So you would say you're still a big fan of the annual Census survey to collect data.
Yeah. Sorry, I've got
to analyze it and push it out and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. I would say I'm always a fan of doing an annual survey that's comprehensive, that's got a combination of static items as well as, standard items, I should say, as well as
items that rotate in and out.
Yeah. I mean, my trick number 2 or 3, whatever it is, I think 2, what I've given you so far, is always add 15 to 20% new items every time you do a survey. And that's simply because that makes it interesting if the rest of the data is boring. Right. And it gives new insights to managers and senior people that they've never seen before. And it makes it feel like a brand new survey. If you do the exact same every time, which is why I have some trouble with benchmark surveys, people get used to it, they get bored. And let's face it, survey data at the aggregate level of a company doesn't change that dramatically year over year. It takes time. So the storyline's pretty boring if it's great to monitor, but you're basically relegating your survey to a monitoring tool if you don't add some new flavor every time. So that's been my trick for 30 years. It's one of them to make it more engaging is to add content.
New stuff. Got it. Well, and speaking of new stuff, and I'm sure in your role you were getting pitched this stuff all the time, but there were things that we see coming onto the market, things like, let's look at people who are overworked by doing calendar scraping.
Oh, yeah.
Or even there's some people out there saying, let's do passive monitoring of people by taking over the cameras in their PC and checking their pupils and all of that kind of stuff. And how do you feel about some of that technology? I'm one of my concerns, of course, is it seems like a huge invasion of privacy.
Yeah.
But going beyond that, are there any technologies out there that, one, you think are promising, or two, there's a tendency to say, let's do it because we can, as opposed to let's do it because it's the right thing to do. What do you think about some of that stuff that's happening?
Yeah, so I think on the plus side, I think some of the AI work that can recommend suggested interventions, especially if you have an intervention pool or you have some data from, sorry, I'm just trying to move this cat here. You have an intervention pool, or you can get some recommendations out of a tool, or even show you where something changed that's more interesting than you might be able to do just on a flat, high and low. So AI can be cool. I think the nudge technology, even though I still fundamentally wonder how much more it is than a reminder, but I get it, right? I get the definitional parts. But I think nudge technology is great. I think that really has, if you get it right and you put it up against the right behaviors you want to have, you can really drive change. I think that's awesome. I am completely paranoid, if you will, about the other technology, some of the others you mentioned, because I do think, and having lived through this even in COVID, I think some leaders will want to use that for other reasons. And it's because they have a theory X versus theory Y mindset, and they just don't believe that people are working. And I don't think there's anything you can do about that, but I don't like the idea of enabling that by technology, right? Just because you can. And so I fought that. I did fight that, and I would fight it consistently. The other piece that of technology I worry about is collecting information on people that is based on things that you're not asking them, right? So it's one thing to observe behaviors in the workplace. Come on. It's one thing to observe behaviors in the workplace. It's another thing to assume you can glean behavioral insights from calendars and from emails. And I'm not a fan of that. And Tomas, I think, has written about this, right? And he wrote a paper a while back with Bob Hogan about, getting IQ and personality scores out of emails. And I mean, that's just crazy. I really don't think that's a wise practice. And I think employees will also really not trust you in the future. And one of the things that's been a hallmark for me anyway, over the years of making surveys and 360s effective is getting people to trust that the data is confidential at a minimum and going to be used for the right purposes. And even just the other day with a client, I was doing an interview and I said, hey, listen, we're doing an interview with 10 of you, 10 different people, and we won't attribute any insights to you individually. It's all going to be rolled up. And the person said to me, so this is an executive member of a big corporation. Sure, that's what they all say. The fact that that's what they believe makes me really nervous. And it goes back to surveys. And the place where that comes up, Jeff, and I fought this to the end, and I still, as far as I know, it's still there, is this whole idea of integrated data, right? So big data or integrating data with other systems. I think it's very cool. I've been a fan of sort of, linkage research, right? As it used to be called.
Yeah.
I love that. And, Janine's dissertation was on that. I mean, I love that stuff. That's fantastic. However, that should not be in the hands of the corporation. My strong feeling on whether it's 360 or surveys is that you need an external vendor always to protect that individual data, do the linkage for you and send it back if you want so you can analyze it. But do not let the internal system link everything up and just hope that protections and hope that security codes and authorizations prevent access. No system works.
Yeah. What you're sort of describing is what I see in the field is, and again, not to denigrate anybody whatsoever, but there's a bit of a sort of a disconnect or a bit of a sort of conflict going on between data scientists and IO psychologists.
Absolutely.
Where the data scientist is, look what I can do. And,
that's right.
And they can do all sorts of cool things.
Yeah.
But the IO psychologist, in some respects, is taking the role of data protection, right? For individuals. Do you feel that was part of your role?
Absolutely. So my 2 CHROs back, when I started doing the senior talent management work, said to me, you're the controller for all sensitive personnel data. And regardless of anybody, she said, even if the CEO asks you, forget it, don't do it. I'll protect you, kind of thing, which is nice to have because not everybody feels they have that protection. But even 2 CHROs later, I kept this and they had to go with it. But it was protect that data at all costs from being misused and being viewed incorrectly. So I got into battles with someone who was a colleague, actually. I won't mention the person's name, but that person was running analytics for us on the same sort of direct report team to the CHRO with myself. And I refused to let that person have access to individual data, whether it was, assessment data, Hogan data, 360, whatever, or survey data, because I just didn't want people thinking that their stuff's being used and that it's being linked. And even if that person did all the right things, I just feel that that's a danger, and to your point about the overall protection, part of my job as the owner of the talent systems was to be the approver of who has access. And it's, again, fortunate that I got that role because I could protect that. But everybody wants hypo data. They want, even individual performance data. They want salary data. They want turnover. They want, how people feel about engagement and then who leaves. Well, you need to do that analysis, right? That's critical to prove your survey works. But I would never let that data get into somebody else's hands. Yeah. I would take that to the wall, Jeff. My team will know there's only a handful of things I'll take to the wall, and that's one of them.
That's one of them. I'm thinking about conversations I've had over many, many years with sort of younger people entering the field and versus older people. Not that I'm going to call us older. But,
not that we're old, right?
But younger people may not, they're establishing themselves or trying to build a career. And I'd like to switch this over to some career advice that you may have for people. But younger people, trying to establish themselves, I think feel less able to push back on CEOs or other high-level executives when they make demands on them. I mean, is that something you can relate to, or is that just my experience?
No, I think that's true. I wouldn't say it's just younger people though.
No. Okay.
I agree that when the folks come out of school and they're earlier in their career, they don't quite know how you might be able to do it or whether or not you can get away with it, and they're worried about their future, of course.
Right.
So that all makes total sense. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a fault of anybody, but once you've established yourself and you have a base, I do think it's very important to be able to feel that you can stand up. And if you can't, and you're very senior and you're now protecting your turf versus doing that, I just think that's not good, you know? And I understand it. I mean, it's human nature, but at some level to protect your livelihood. I get that. But to me, as a psychologist, this is where my psychology OD background comes into play. I do feel that we should be protecting some things and we should stand up for some things. And if you get rolled, you get rolled, but you fought it as best you could. So here's an example of that. So when I was first doing the survey for Steve, so it's probably a couple of years in with him, we did some D&I questions. We were learning, I mean, work-life balance was always a challenge at PepsiCo. And there was a question about that. There was also a question about benefits. What benefits would you like to have? And one of the sub-questions was 401k. We didn't have one. And there was a question on work-life and, whether or not we support it. The scores were never good. And I was talking to Steve at one point about a metric of 5 items for the executive committee to drive change over time. And every year we would ask that and they would get bonused on it. And I said, we ought to put that work life in there. And he said, no, it's never going to change. So I don't want to false drive senior leaders
expectations.
Yeah, that won't change. And I said, but that's the point. So I fought him about that. And he said, all right, you win. I'll let you do it. It's still in there to this survey today, and it's 20 points higher than it was 20 years ago. Still not great. I mean, it's a company, right? It's a hard charging company, but it is much, much better. And then the 401k, same thing. It's one of those examples of something that many companies had. And I don't know why we wouldn't ask if that was something one day we might do. And I was told, nope, we don't need it. Well, guess what? We went ahead and added 401k later. And then they said, hey, Allan, where's the data? Sorry, so I think there are times when you want to be able to push back, and it helps to have the experience and having worked with other clients. So my consulting background helped coming in and knowing that I was there to do that. I think it's a lot tougher if you're in a company that doesn't appreciate expertise at all, and everybody thinks they're equally. I mean, a lot of times it happens anyway, but if you're in a company that doesn't appreciate the expertise, it's harder to fight the battle.
Mm-hmm. So let me shift this just slightly here based on this conversation. Not to embarrass you, Allan, but you have a very strong personal brand. You're very well known in the IO world, and I think talent management world, survey world, OD world, etc. How important is it if we probably have some mid-career, younger career people on this call today? How important is it that they spend time developing their personal brand in order to achieve some of the things you did in terms of, moving an organization from A to B or getting the opportunities? And what advice do you have to them in terms of how to go about developing that personal brand?
Yeah, so I think first, and thank you for the compliment. I'm just a driven, crazy person. So that is what it is, right? It's a little bit hard to just say you got to do that, but that aside, I think, part of it is having that brand and having had the experience does help you. So it's very important, I think, to be able to build that. And honestly, in my career, I built it even when the companies I was with didn't want me to, right? So, I mean, it's not like PepsiCo historically let me do what I did, right? I didn't go for approval, though, for a lot of it. And most of the time, I didn't even tell anybody I was doing these things. When I joined PepsiCo, I gave my resume to my boss at the time, who was a CHRO somewhere else still today, and he threw it back at me and said, how do you do any work with the stuff you do? Mm-hmm. I mean, and I said, well, I do it around the edges, you know, I'll get my work done. I'll be great. Don't worry, but I'm still going to do this. You got to let me do it or I won't come. And he said, all right, fine. As long as it didn't get in the way. And that was the attitude for 20 years, Jeff. So it wasn't like PepsiCo supported me doing anything. They let me go to SIOP, of course, pay for things, but everything else was kind of on the side. And so I think, you know, having that passion to do it is important. I think having the willingness and the sort of energy to do it, to make time to create your brand is important. When I was first doing, you know, in the field, so to speak, trying to create a name, or at least trying to have an impact, I should say, really, I went to like the Eastern Psychology Association conference to present. There were 10 people in the audience. I mean, why it was worth going for 10 people, I don't know, but I did a lot of things just to get in there. I volunteered to review for places. I volunteered to do special issues or write a column for Tip or all kinds of things over the years that, I don't know, the gestalt of it pays off, but it wasn't like everything was a calculated decision, you know? Mm-hmm. But I do think having that brand ultimately is what gives you a lot of credibility to lean on when you're fighting the good fight.
But what was a calculated decision is, right, it's not going to be chance that is going to create this personal brand.
Right.
I'm going to put myself out there. I'm going to make myself visible. I'm going to participate as much as I can.
Yeah, exactly. And find the places that, you know, I can really make an impact. And so I did, you know, column and stuff. But what I would say for people, and my team over the years knows this because we published a lot together. One of the things I really like to do is publish with other people because it's not easy for some people. They haven't done a lot of it. They don't have a good sense for how it works. And, you know, to me, one sort of principle is every time I finish something, I write about it as soon as I can. And it's kind of a way of closing the book on that learning, that project, that process, getting it out there before I lose the you know, insights I had, the learnings I had, but also before I get bored with it and move on to something else. And so a lot of what I write is after I've finished it, or at least when it's, you know, large pieces of it are done. So that's one piece. So I would say that's, you know, a big one. But I honestly, Jeff, it would be present, which is easier to do than publish, do research, present it, publish it again, and then go for awards, right? I mean, that's just sort of the cycle. So one of the things we used to do on the team was have literally whiteboard meeting days. It sounds super nerdy, but I do have pictures, so it's real. We would sit there in a talk room with the whiteboard and write down ideas for papers. And, you know, crazy ideas or whatever it might be. For SIOP, every year we would get together with 20 of us roughly and say, what are we doing this year? Let's all get our ideas on the table. We'd rank them. People would sign up. And that produced a lot of energy for the group as well as, you know, individuals. But it's, you got to actively do it because no companies, well, at least many, are not going to just say, put it in your objectives and I'll pay you to do it, right? It's right. More, wow, you did this? You have an article? So an example of that. So it was a couple years into our senior program. I want to say around 214-ish maybe. And there was an article around assessments that came out in Harvard Business Review. And I got a call down from my CHRO at the time. And she said, hey, we have a board meeting tomorrow. And they're asking about assessments. Do we have anything on the work we're doing? And I said, yeah, actually, I've got a research article. I've got a book chapter and I've got a pop article. Which do you want? She's like, the pop article. I gave them the pop article and they loved it.
Yeah.
And nobody knew I had those, including my boss. Right. Mm-hmm. But it was cool to have them. And I think that's just part of it, Jeff, is sharing what you do, sharing what you've learned with the field, talking to people about it, doing these kinds of connects, you know, and just being out there, you know. So that's been my goal. It hasn't been like, I want to do XYZ strategic articles. You know, it's
right. No,
I just kind of do what's fun.
You know, what it also does, I think, is it makes PepsiCo, your efforts there for others as well, it makes it a very good place to be from.
Right.
And that attracts new people into the organization over time, right? In terms of attracting talent. Which is sort of what GE tried to do with management. I know PepsiCo did the same thing. They wanted it to be a very good place to be from because from there, lots of other opportunities, lots of other doors could open up for you.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So
I think there were other firms that did that too, right? I mean, over the years, and that back to your cycle question there, if you have a good group and they're active, you can have a nice presence for a number of years, and it's an attraction, retention issue. And then honestly, those people go on to other cool places. I mean, I've got so many. I had like 25 interns over the years, and one of them is a CHRO for sure, but others are off SVPs all over the place. It's amazing, so it is fun to be able to do that.
Right, it is. So let's see if we have any time for any questions. We only have just a few minutes left. One of the things I would like to mention is if you want to ask questions, put it in the Q&A, and Amanda is monitoring the Q&A to see if there's any questions there.
We actually have a ton of questions.
You want to pick a couple, Amanda?
Sure. Allan, how do you balance the local and the firm-wide strategic set of items in the census survey that every leader gets a report?
Yeah, so I think you have to know what your outer limit on length is in a way, because that's kind of what you're working against, right, as your ceiling. So let's just say that that you can't get over 60 or 50. Then I would literally think about it in terms of 60, 20, 20. And I would say 60% is for the front line, for the majority of the population. Make sure that you've got people in your design group or in your review group that will appreciate having that data at local levels, right? And all the way down to groups of 10 or whatever, 20, whatever your minimum is going to be. The next 20%, I would say, go talk to other strategic leaders that have agendas that are going to be important, right? So head of diversity or head of legal or head of IT, I mean, whatever. There's lots of sub functions that have agendas that could have some interesting, and give them 2 items, 3 items, right? That's it. They have a little real estate, and that's all you're going to let them have, but make sure they're really, really good items and work with them. Don't just ask them. Work with them and say, listen, if I gave you feedback on this and I cut it by all the businesses, would this make a difference? And then the last 20%, I would make sure your CHRO and your CEO, and maybe a couple other CEOs, if you have them, or whatever, senior leaders in the business, have a chance to do the same. So you get some time with them at a minimum to say, what if I came back to you with 3 things? What would they be that would really make a difference to you in the way we run the business, or the way you're going to set the strategy for the next 5 years, or how you report to the board, or how you report to stakeholders at the annual meeting? And let them tell you those. And they may be horrible items, and everybody else may vomit on them, but that's okay, because they're the CEO questions. And you just have to go do that and build the content. But the most important thing is making sure that you don't get crap items from them, that you work with them to make them really good items. Because if they're really good, other people will probably appreciate the insights too.
Okay, great. And just so we have time for a few more here, what kind of messaging has worked for you when trying to defend and protect data privacy to leaders who may be interested in new, shiny analytical tools?
Yeah. So the best defense there, other than the ethics kind of standard thing, which doesn't play all the time, is from a U.S. context, is the legal defensibility and the issue around exposure from a risk point of view from the company. So if you're out there expressing that the survey is confidential and there's any breach of that confidentiality, that is a potential legal exposure for the company. And I would say to them, listen, if there's been any snafus whatsoever with permissions in your system, which I'd be surprised if there's ever any perfect system, that is a risk that's going to damage the reputation and potentially the value of the company externally. Just imagine your CEO is sitting there and there's a story that breaks in the Wall Street Journal that, XYZ employees have said X, and now the people are going after them fired. Look at, one of the local retailers who there's a perception that people are getting fired because they tried to do unionization work. Mm-hmm. What if the same thing happened in a survey? So that's another one that I've used. And then the third one, honestly, is if you have a culture where you want to believe people are empowered to give their views, and you believe in speak up, and you believe in all these things that people give voice, you cannot do anything that compromises even once the belief that that voice is real. So those are the 3 arguments I've tried to use. And for me, they were successful. But again, I did have to fight the good fight.
And I think we are at time. So I'm going to, let me share my screen again. And I think people should be able to see this. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 more of these already scheduled. And if you'd like to sign up, there's still plenty of time. I know Eli Lilly is one of the things they're going to be talking about is this the thing you've read in the paper about quiet quitting, for instance.
Quiet quitting. Yep.
Quiet quitting. My tech is going to be talking about walking into a green field where nothing existed and how did he build it. Caterpillar has a long history of using these things, as well as Dell technology. So if you'd like to hear any more of these fireside chats, please, it's not too late to sign up. Any concluding remarks, Allan, before we let everybody go?
No, I just think it's been great to have the chat, and I hope people have gotten a sense of my personal kind of perspective on these things, as well as some tidbits. The one tidbit I will give you also, though, I just have to give you the other tricks now. So
okay.
So the first one is always 75% the same, 25 to 15% new. The second one is always include strategic content for the CEO. What 3-4 things do you want to know? The third is always add items when you're doing design work that you're going to throw out. Add a few bad items so that you can sacrifice those later to keep the ones you really want. Don't start with your favorite core items out of the gate, or you'll lose some of those regardless. Never give the data to people before you've gotten to the C-suite, if at all possible. And the question about external impact and writing and all that, presenting, always keep a balance of good storytelling and data, and don't whitewash the data, but you have to go with the question: if the Wall Street Journal got a handle or got a hold on your presentation or on your paper, what would they say about the company, and would it hurt the stock or the CEO? If you're clean with that answer, you're good to publish. So
great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yep, no problem. Our pleasure. And Allan, if people want to reach out and follow up with any specific questions, would that be okay?
Oh, of course. Okay. I know there's some questions on here pretty specifically to the performance review or the evaluation element. So yeah, happy to chat. It's I don't know if you have it on there, Amanda, but it's Allan, ALLANHC2020@gmail.com.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. And
all right,
thanks everybody for attending.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.